The overall organization of the building is quite simple. It is actually strangely reminiscent of the structure of a church, with a central nave which is 72 feet large and rises at a height of 64 feet, but which is actually 4 times longer than the greatest church in the United Kingdom, St. Paul, and of course with a much thinner structure. These made a very spectacular impression on all the visitors. This is the Crystal Palace immediately after the end of the Great Exhibition, and we can see this kind of impression of infinity. It was perhaps the first time that a building gave this impression of being infinite, this repetitive, almost infinite space in which the eye got almost lost. I mentioned the trees. Here we have the transept of the Crystal Palace with one of the trees. And we are, by the same token, introduced to another theme that will play an important role throughout the Great Exhibition, which is the juxtaposition of the natural and the artificial, with a suggestion that human industry is actually an extension of a kind of fecundity of nature itself. The main entrance of the exhibition was through the transept, and people immediately discovered the trees, but also fountains, colors. I'll come back to the ambience of the Great Exhibition because this is also an important aspect that gave the building also its mythical character. Because of its scale, the building confronted its designers to completely unexpected problem. One was actually how to evacuate water, the rain that fell on the roof. Because of the surface the building covered, this problem of how to get rid of the water was actually pretty crucial. The solution adopted, which Paxton had tested but at a much smaller scale in his Lily house, was actually to use hollow columns in which the water would actually be evacuated. The new thing was actually that at the bottom of the column you found pipes that were directly related to the sewers of the city. So we understand another thing, which is that this is actually the beginning of the merging between the buildings and infrastructure. The building is so large that it becomes commensurable with the urban infrastructure as a whole. Since the construction of the Crystal Palace in 1851, this potential blurring between architecture and infrastructure has been with us repeatedly. This has been the case, for example, with the Kansai Airport, built by Renzo Piano in Japan, which was, at the time of its completion, one of the largest buildings in the world, a few kilometers long. It's quite revealing that actually Ove Arup, when presenting, in order to give an idea of the scale of the building, actually used Hyde Park, the very site where the Crystal Palace was constructed, as if large country buildings like the Kansai Airport Terminal were actually the inheritor, and they are indeed, of this kind of gigantism that was introduced at the time of the Crystal Palace. Another interesting aspect to note is actually the kind of double level of reading of a structure like this one. Let's pay attention, for example, to the node. In order to additionally stabilize the structure, you have these giant ties that intersect, and there you have a node in the middle. Look at the complexity of the node. Of course, you don't discover it immediately, but actually iron construction will be marked by this kind of tension between the overall appearance and the details, and the secret complementarity between the two. This is something to keep in mind, is that in iron, because of the very repetitive nature, etc., detail do matter. God is in the detail, as some famous architect would later say. And Paxton is somebody who works, once again, both about the overall scheme, but also in these very minute details. In order to understand that, another buildings built much later, actually the Eiffel Tower of 1889, the overall impression is actually very much dependent of the type of node used. Here you have the typical node of the Eiffel Tower, and there again there is this complementarity between the overall impression and details that are kind of almost subliminal, but do play actually quite an important role in the reading of the structure. The famous art critic and theorist John Ruskin had a very mixed feeling about the Crystal Palace, because of course he was impressed by the performance, as if, as he said, the whole world had been encompassed by a single building. But at the same time, and we'll return to that, he was critical because iron was not his favorite material and he despised industrialization. Nevertheless, saying that the whole world could now be sheltered in a single building introduces another very important dimension of this building, which is a kind of environmental quality. This is a building in which ventilation, the control of humidity, all these questions that we think have arisen only recently were already present. You have to imagine millions of people sweating, etc. You have to imagine the heat, even in London, sometimes you can get sun, and the building can get pretty hot. So the typical problem of a greenhouse, but of course it was a greenhouse not for tropical plants, but for people. This is actually one of the louvers of Paxton, and actually the building is inseparable from complex problems of ventilation that there again we take for granted, but were for the first time really addressed at such a scale. The Crystal Palace was mythical not only because of the very unique ambience it offered to its visitor, but also because of the construction. The construction is an integral part of the myth. One could even say that it was the first time that construction was really as much associated with the meaning of the building. The contemporaries were completely struck by how these standardized pieces arrived on site, were assembled. This is the beginning also of the fascination for dry assemblage. So nothing having to do with the wetness of mortar, nothing like, all these traditional construction technique, but something like a magic dance of parts, pieces. Not yet machines. Horses were still the main source of power on the construction. In some ways, the Marxian notion of forces of production was probably, was almost illustrated by such a ballet of industrial components. Throughout the construction, Paxton was, of course, present and had multiple opportunities to show his ingenuity. For example, putting in place the barrel vault elements of the transept was not such a simple process. As we can see on this engraving, the barrel vault elements were actually in wood. There again, we find this complexity and this mix of traditional and more modern elements. The construction site was, by the way, really a spectacle, and Fox and Henderson sold actually tickets in order for the public to come and visit and see what was going on. Speaking of ingenuity, Paxton also designed a number of machines for edging, grazing, for all kinds of purposes on the construction site. Here we find also another interesting aspect of what the Crystal Palace was about, which is a kind of continuity between structural and mechanical engineering, something very specific to the British scene in many respects. On the continent, engineers or builders did not always imagine machines. Here, to design machine and to design a building are part of the same continuum. And this is also a very important aspect, an aspect that might explain in some ways why high-tech, the high-tech expression was a product of Great Britain in the 20th century, as if, this legacy of articulation between machines and buildings had remained an enduring tradition. Putting in place the glass for the roof was also quite something, an enormous enterprise, in which, of course, risk was present. The glass could break, could fall on the workers working below, so special precaution had to be taken. There again, innovative techniques were put into place. For example, you have these little carriages on rails that enabled actually to go a bit faster when putting in place the large sheets of glass produced by the Chance Brothers factory. Here on this vision, if you pay a closer attention, you will see actually the little carriages circulating on top of the building on the rails and putting in place the glass, while on the front of the picture you have horses which are used to lift a girder of the nave. So we can see there again this mix of innovation and tradition. Mechanization would take over far later on construction sites. The result was a completely strange space for the contemporaries. Something fascinating, but something that was not easy to categorize. Was it architecture? Was it something else? I have mentioned the blurring between architecture and infrastructure. In some ways, the Crystal Palace was sublime. That's to say, something that escaped usual aesthetic categories. And Paxton himself was never fully recognized as a fully fledged designer. It's quite revealing that despite this spectacular achievement, he was never awarded the Medal of the Royal Institute of British Architects, as if, the nature of what he had produced remained uncertain. This strangely repetitive, fascinating space, but was it really an architectural creation? And there, of course, we understand why John Ruskin was so reluctant. Was it still art in the traditional sense? Where was the hand of the craftsman that Ruskin praised above everything? All these traditional dimensions of art and architecture had vanished in this enchantment of iron and glass that would fascinate millions of people, but the status of which remained very unclear in the eye of the professional. One can say that the Crystal Palace marks the beginning of the split between the taste of the public at large and what professionals like architects care about. The Crystal Palace is sublime because it's spectacular in terms of size, because of the emotion it gave to the people who practiced it, but it's also something that doesn't have a clear status in terms of architecture. On this view, we can almost feel this sublimity linked to idea of infinity, of transparency, and we can also understand why people who appreciated Greek temple or Gothic churches could feel a bit ill at ease in front of such a construction that did not enter any clear category of the history of architecture.